Welcome, Gunrunner.
This latest Amazing Facts poll really took me by surprise, because the Apple IIgs went into an early lead, and by some margin too, and I thought there was no catching it. But somehow the Sinclair QL managed to draw level for a day or so, and then the Apple IIgs went back into the lead, and I thought nothing more of it. Then it came to making this video, and I thought I'd better have a quick check of the poll and grab a screenshot, and I was absolutely stunned to discover that the QL had won. I never saw that coming, as usually an American computer will always beat a British one in a straight fight, as my American audience is far larger than my British one, a fair reflection of the population difference. Okay, there was only 2% in it, but the QL won nonetheless and beat off the advances of not only the Apple IIgs, but also the Mattel Aquarius and Sword M5 in a very distant 4th place. In many ways, I was pleased to see the QL win, not just as a Brit and a fan of Sinclair in general, but also because I had a friend who had one when I was a kid. It wasn't really his as such, his dad had bought it for the home and the only games he had for it were chess and tennis, but I remember thinking how futuristic it looked at the time, especially compared to the Spectrum. Finally released in early '84, after numerous delays, the computer that was originally codenamed the ZX83 was one of the first 16-bit home computers on the market, over a year before the Atari ST and Amiga, and led a very troubled existence. In the end, it was the takeover of Sinclair Research by Alan Sugar and his company Amstrad in 1986 that finally killed it, but it was already on life support for reasons I'll go into. This is certainly a very good lesson in what not to do when you release a new home computer. But I don't want to give too much away in this intro, so let's get going.
You are about to witness Sir Clive Sinclair's quantum leap. He's come up with a computer to rival these machines at a fraction of their cost. The Sinclair QL system, with a massive 128K memory, color monitor and 4 professional software packages, £698. Firm 200-0200 for your nearest stockist.
I think it's important to start this video by explaining just how the Sinclair QL came about, even though this particular part of the story was covered pretty well in the brilliant BBC produced film The Micromen, which I'm sure you've all seen, but if you haven't, then what's wrong with you? And to tell this story we have to go right back to 1981 with the British Broadcasting Corporation announcing what would become known as the BBC Computer Literacy Project. This scheme was initiated partly in response to an ITV documentary series called The Mighty Micro, which predicted the coming microcomputer revolution and its effect on not just the UK economy and technology industry in general, but people's home lives. The BBC wanted to design its project around a microcomputer capable of performing a series of quite specific tasks that they could demonstrate on a new TV series called The Computer Programme, rather originally. The list of topics would include programming, graphics, sound and music, teletext, controlling external hardware and even artificial intelligence. The company created a rather ambitious specification for the BBC branded computer, which they insisted must be built by a British company. This led them into speaking to several industry leaders in this sector, including the likes of Newbury Laboratories, Tangerine Computer Systems and most notably Sinclair Research. But it was another new upstart company that came out of nowhere to take the contract, which most people had already assumed would be granted to Sinclair. That company was Acorn, led by former Sinclair employee Chris Curry. They were already working on a new computer as a successor to their Atom, named the Proton. Due to a mix of hard work from the Acorn team and complacency from Sinclair, Acorn would win the bid to supply this new computer and the BBC Micro was born. The machine that was put forward by Sinclair, then called the ZX82, but eventually released as the Spectrum, was lacking in many areas and would require a radical rethink in its design in order to meet the spec. And this is why the BBC chose Acorn's proposal instead. But this decision left Sir Clive Sinclair feeling furious. He couldn't believe he'd been beaten to the punch by his former protege, and he was adamant that he would get his revenge and teach Chris Curry a lesson. To deliver the planned bloody nose, he knew he would have to come up with a high-end computer that was more powerful than the Spectrum, and of course the BBC Micro 2. And his vision was the Sinclair Quantum Leap, a computer that was a generation beyond everything else on the market. Following the release of the ZX Spectrum in 1982, Sinclair put all their efforts into the development of the QL, and it wasn't long before the first rumours of what the computer would be appeared in the press. This was very much the origins of the long talked about Super Spectrum legend. The original plan for the QL was that it would be Z80 based like all the other Sinclair computers that appeared before it, but the talented engineers at Sinclair soon convinced Clive that this was the wrong option. If the QL was genuinely going to be the next generation computer that he wanted it to be, it would need a lot more power, and his team suggested the Motorola 68000, a CPU that had now been on the market for several years but was only just starting to become an affordable mass market product. However, despite the recent price drops, Sir Clive still felt that the M68K was too expensive. He had always been a man who wanted to do things as cheaply as possible, as evidenced by both the ZX81 and Spectrum, so he contacted Motorola to see what else was available and discovered the existence of the much cheaper 68008, a cut-down version of the CPU that used an 8-bit data bus instead of 16 and used less pins on the board. This meant that it ran at roughly half the speed of the full 16-bit version, a rather short-sighted decision by Sinclair. Meanwhile, Sir Clive also got a whiff that there was already some competition on the horizon, as American rivals Apple were also working on a new 16-bit computer based on that very same Motorola 68000 processor. So he hastily announced the QL exactly 1 week before Apple did their big announcement for the Macintosh, and declared that his company would be the first to go 16-bit, hoping to steal all their thunder. This segment leads on perfectly from the last, because I think it's important to discuss the overall specifications of the QL, not just its somewhat hamstrung CPU. Initially, there were loads of wild ideas about what form the QL would take, including a portable computer with a built-in modem and built-in screen, ideas Sinclair later came back to, which I'll talk about in due course, and a proper typewriter-like keyboard. Ultimately, the final design was a lot less ambitious, mostly driven by cost. The typewriter-like keyboard was replaced with a kind of halfway house between a proper keyboard and the horrible dead-flesh chiclet keyboard of the ZX Spectrum, which isn't unlike the kinds of keyboards you'd find on modern laptops actually. This keyboard would later be reused on the Spectrum Plus computers, of course. The case would also include various ports including RS-232, ROM cartridge slot, expansion bus, joystick ports and a network socket, as well as twin microdrives instead of the much more bulky and expensive disk drives many of its rivals would use. I'll come back to these separately as they're a key part of the design. Alongside that Motorola 68008 CPU at 7.5 MHz, there was 128K of RAM, a pretty generous amount at this period in time. In terms of graphics, the QL has two different modes, 8 colours with 256x256 resolution, and high res with 4 colours and a 512x256 resolution. It has a 32K frame buffer and allows double buffering, switching between two separate banks of RAM. This isn't bad, but 8 colours seems very low when most computers had at least 16. For its audio, the QL goes down a similar route to the Atari 8-bit and its Pokey chip, although in a far less spectacular manner. That's because the Intel 8049 microcontroller, a variant of the 8048 that was seen in the Magnavox Odyssey 2 and Philips Video Pack, can also act as a simple noise generator, as well as taking charge of reading all inputs, including the keyboard, controllers and expansion ports. The quick announcement of the QL in 1982, just after the launch of the ZX Spectrum and the proposed mid-83 release date, took a lot of people by surprise, who speculated that there was no way Sinclair would be able to develop such a powerful computer in this time frame, and they ended up being proved correct, as the catalogue of disasters, mostly down to delays in the design of its ULA and operating system, saw it delayed several times. After the official release date was shifted on numerous occasions, Sinclair settled on January the 12th, 1984, to make sure it would beat the Apple Macintosh to market by around a month. However, when this date finally came, there was still no working prototype, and Sir Clive still had a lot of questions to answer, as his company was still taking pre-orders despite being totally unable to deliver. This saw Sinclair Research being heavily fined by the UK Advertising Standards Authority for false marketing. They were told they had just 28 days to start shipping QL computers or they would face another fine. This did very little to speed things along, and it was April before we saw any units at all, and these were far from finished, as they came with a special dongle, referred to by Sinclair as the Clutch, which plugged into the cartridge port to provide an early and very buggy version of the operating system. When finished QL computers did finally start to ship some 6 months later, they were riddled with problems, from broken microdrives and faulty chips to being completely dead right out of the box. Many people had to return their computers to Sinclair to be fixed, and reception to the QL in the press of the time was lukewarm at best, with the leading magazine Byte describing it as a premature baby. They also moaned that it was far too slow and criticised the emasculated CPU. They did say that they thought it was superior to the wildly overpriced BBC Micro. Despite healthy pre-orders, the delays led to lots of cancellations and refunds, with retail sales being non-existent, and Sinclair actually put production of the computer on hold in 1985 before it was completely discontinued by Amstrad after their takeover of Sinclair Research in 1986. I already touched on the issue of the QL's microdrives earlier in this video and how they were a big part of the computer's problems. Sir Clive himself was a huge fan of them, once describing them as a marvellous approach to the idea of data storage, but consumers and the press clearly felt otherwise, as they were widely criticised for being limited in function and unreliable too. It's no coincidence that the first third-party add-ons that arrived on the market for the QL were external disk drives. These tiny tape-like cartridges were supposed to be a much cheaper alternative to discs, and the expensive and then very bulky drives were required to read them. There were two big issues that plagued them and caused that unreliable tag to be placed on them. Firstly, there was the issue that they could be wiped far too easily, being highly prone to magnetic interference. Secondly, there was the problem of the internal tape stretching after continuous use, making them unreadable. Although fixes were eventually made to correct these problems, especially with the latest Samsung-produced drives, the damage was already done as far as their reputation goes, and those who did own a QL started looking for other solutions, such as those third-party produced disk drives I mentioned earlier. But Sinclair didn't completely bury their heads in the sand, as they were hurriedly developing a new version of the QL that used a completely different storage medium. So let's carry on right where we left off and talk about Sinclair's idea for the microdrive's replacement. Now you might be thinking that this would be some sort of disk drive instead, which would seem the logical option, but Sinclair, being Sinclair, wanted something new and revolutionary, and this new storage medium would be called the Sinclair Wafer drive, and was a very exciting concept indeed. It wasn't unlike a modern SSD hard drive in many ways, as instead of individual RAM chips or a large magnetic disk, this contained an entire silicon wafer with multiple chip dies, meaning any imperfections in the wafer would cause the dies covering them to fail. So the drive was intelligent enough to automatically route around any failed units. This was seen as foolproof, the complete reverse of those dreaded microdrives. Sinclair developed several versions of this, a small add-on for existing QL users that was slotted into the side of the computer, a larger external drive, and a new model of the QL with the new Wafer drive totally replacing the old microdrives. Codenamed Janus, also known as the QL Plus, Sinclair's chief designer Rick Dickinson mocked up several different designs for the Wafer Drive add-on and the new computer too, and they look absolutely amazing, like something from the future. And it's a shame that this machine never made it out the door. You've probably already guessed why, although I'll confirm this in a minute, so you'll have to bear with me until the end of the next entry if you don't know, as they are very closely related. So you might have already guessed by my ending to the last segment, but this next computer is also very closely related to the QL Plus, but is very much its own thing, especially given how it developed, and so very much deserves its own segment in this video. Now I already mentioned that the QL with a built-in disk drive or two would have been the easiest solution to the Microdrive issue, so it probably won't come as much of a surprise to learn that this was something Sinclair very much considered. In fact, it went a bit further than that, as they set about developing a disk-based QL as a backup plan in case they couldn't get the Wafer to function as they wanted. Dubbed the Enigma, this was just an idea at first, but then Sir Clive saw the success of the PCW from rivals Amstrad, designed specifically for office-based tasks like spreadsheets and word processing, and decided this new market presented an ideal opportunity to reimagine the Enigma idea. The original idea to make it a QL-compatible computer was then abandoned, and the Enigma would now become a cheap PC-compatible instead. Unlike the PCW, this computer would be fully compatible with the existing IBM PC standard, but Sir Clive felt that they could come up with something much cheaper than all the existing PC clones on the market, and at a much more competitive price too. He figured that a full PC compatible would tempt people away from the Amstrad PCW and into the arms of Sinclair, and he was probably right. Unfortunately, the Enigma never got much further than a few rough mock-ups, and the development of the computer was cancelled when Amstrad, rather ironically in this case, took over Sinclair and immediately closed down the company's R&D department. Ask an Amiga fan what makes their computers so great, and they'll reel off a list of achievements that likely includes a claim that the 16-bit Commodore computer was the first to include a multitasking operating system. But it wasn't, because around 2 years earlier, the QL did just that, with the incredibly innovative QDOS. In fact, one of the big brags about the QL at its time of release from Sinclair Research was the fact it was the first mass-market home computer with an integrated OS featuring preemptive multitasking and a Windows-style operating system, predating Microsoft Windows 95 by 11 years, the Amiga by nearly 2 years, and the Apple computer Macintosh launch by a month. Although QDOS wasn't bundled with the first batch of QL computers, it was included in the ROM of all later models and continued to be developed further throughout the QL's life by creator Tony Tebby, where it evolved into Minerva and SMSQE. Many would argue that the multitasking abilities of the QL was its biggest legacy, and it's such a shame that Sinclair couldn't have built on this feature further and made more packages that could take advantage of it. As they say, knowing is half the battle. Remember when I talked about the original design for the QL in the early part of this video, and a vision for a somewhat portable computer that would have its own screen and a built-in modem? Well, I said I would come back to that later on, and here we are, because although it would be a stretch to call the one per desk a portable computer, it does have all those features from the original vision. The result of a 3-year collaboration between Sinclair Research, ICL and British Telecom, the one per desk added a telephone handset to the end of the keyboard, rudimentary computer telephony integration software, and was offered with a colour or monochrome screen. Early interest in this machine was actually very high, and it ended up being used in several UK government agencies, including Customs and Excise, the Post Office, and of course by co-creators British Telecom. Outside of this though, pickup was slow, mainly down to the lack of software support, but it did carve a rather unusual niche, being used by bingo halls across the country. Although the one per desk was essentially designed for the business market, a rebranded version of the all-in-one computer did enter general retail in the form of the British Telecom Tonto. This was then picked up and rebranded again by BT's partners in Australia as the Computer Phone. Rather bizarrely, there was also an American version too, known as the Mega OPD, which had double the amount of RAM and a revised version of the software which featured a New Jersey accent on the answer phone message. None of these later revisions were very successful at all. I'm very aware that this video has been a rather negative and sorrowful affair. It was pretty much impossible not to make it so, given how badly the QL failed and all the mistakes that Sinclair made creating it. But I really wanted to finish the video on a positive note, and there's no doubting that this segment is just that, and also a celebration of the QL's biggest legacy. You see, the creation of the ever popular Linux operating system only came about because of the Sinclair QL, which creator Linus Torvalds owned in the mid-80s. In interviews he stated that the lack of available software for the QL in his home nation of Finland led him to creating his own programs for the machine. His frustration with the QL's own buggy OS, as well as its adaptation of Unix, called Minix, led him into trying to create his own more efficient version of the program that continued his development when he upgraded to an IBM PC compatible a bit later on. And the rest, as they say, is history. Torvalds still looks back very fondly on the Sinclair QL, which he said he bought back in 1987 because it looked cool. He liked its matte black finish and angular lines, but didn't like the microdrives, and that's what pushed him into writing his first QL program, a driver for the new 5¼ disk drives that he had bought not long after. Rather amusingly, he also said that, like any good computer purist, raised on a Motorola 68000 chip, he despised PCs, but then decided in autumn 1990 to bite the bullet, and he purchased an Intel 386 PC compatible in January 1991. And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing Sinclair QL facts. But which of these fabulous facts was your favourite, or can you think of any other tantalising tidbits of trivia that I didn't include? I would also love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comments section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons and YouTube members for continuing to support this channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following people in particular for their much appreciated pledges: CPC Magnetic Media, Black Siren, James Welch, Wesley K, Glacier 9, Cellphone Smartphone, Timu Mackie, Tailboy 2011, Andrew Christensen, Brendan O'Neill, Hunter Bungay, Krispy Kreme, Richard Tate, Sarah B, Craig, Carl Cloping, John Albarino, Richard Baker, Bernard Santu, Mins, Martin Wiggins, Mark Strickland, Ben P. Stein, Tabby Kitsune, Paul Daniel, Grady Haynes, Carl Olsen, Sathy Robinson, Classic Gamer 74, D. Vaughan, Marco, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support this channel, you can now join as a member of as little as £2 a month, where you'll get access to exclusive videos and updates, and much more besides. Just click the button on my community page to get started. My Patreon is also still available if you prefer to support me in other ways too. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.